I still remember the exact moment I knew I was going to be screwed over. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, the kind of spring day in Seattle where the rain comes and goes every 20 minutes, teasing you with glimpses of blue sky before drowning you again. I was sitting in my cubicle at Vertex Analytics, staring at the quarterly report I'd just finished compiling when Scott Mercer, my direct manager, stopped by. "Hey Alex, how's that cost analysis project coming along?" he asked, leaning against my desk with that practiced casual pose of his. 6 feet tall, always in pressed shirts with the sleeves rolled up just so, with that MBA polished smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Just wrapped it up," I said, unable to hide the pride in my voice. "The automation protocol I designed could save us around $2 million annually once fully implemented." Scott's eyebrows shot up, and for a split second, I saw something flash across his face, surprise, followed by calculation. $2 million? That's impressive. Send it to me right away. The executive meeting's on Thursday, and this could be exactly what we need. As he walked away, I should have felt good. I'd been working at Vertex for 3 years as a senior data analyst, consistently delivering solid work but never anything that made real waves. Until now. This project was different. 3 months of late nights, weekends sacrificed, countless iterations of code and formulas until I'd created something that could genuinely transform our outdated supply chain operations. Instead of feeling good though, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. It was the way his voice changed when I mentioned the dollar amount. The way his eyes narrowed slightly as he asked me to send him the files. Maybe I was being paranoid, but 5 years in corporate America had taught me that credit flows upward while blame trickles down. Still, I told myself I was overthinking it. Scott had always been decent to me. Not warm, not particularly mentoring, but professional. He'd approved my requests for training, given me acceptable performance reviews. No reason to assume the worst. I emailed him the complete project files that evening: spreadsheets, automation scripts, implementation timeline, cost projections, everything. Each file meticulously organized, documented, and, though I didn't think much of it at the time, automatically timestamped by our company's document management system. The next morning, I received a brief reply: "Good work. I'll review and incorporate into the presentation for Thursday." That should have been my second warning. Incorporate, not present together. But I was too excited about the project itself, too invested in what it could do for the company, to dwell on office politics. My name is Alexander Chin, by the way. 31 years old, second-generation Chinese-American with a master's in data science from University of Washington. I joined Vertex right after graduation, drawn by their work in supply chain analytics and the promise that I could make a real impact in a growing Seattle tech company. My parents, dad an engineer, mom a pharmacist, had instilled in me their immigrant work ethic: keep your head down, work hard, excellence will be recognized. That Wednesday, the day before the executive presentation, Scott was out of the office all day. Strategic meetings downtown, his calendar said. I used the time to polish a few details on my project, even though I'd already sent him the files. I couldn't help it. This was the most significant work I'd done in my career, and I wanted it to be perfect. As I was leaving that evening, I ran into Diane from HR in the elevator. "Big presentation tomorrow, huh?" she said, smiling. "Scott's been talking it up to everyone. Says it's going to revolutionize our processes." "Yeah," I replied, trying to mask my confusion. "It should make a big difference. He's been working so hard on it," she continued. "Meredith told me he was here until midnight last week finalizing everything." The elevator reached the lobby before I could respond, which was probably a good thing because I had no idea what to say. Scott had been here until midnight? Working on what? My project had been entirely my initiative, developed on my own time. Scott hadn't even known the details until yesterday. That night, I barely slept. Something didn't feel right, but I kept telling myself I was jumping to conclusions. Maybe Diane had misunderstood. Maybe Scott had been working on other aspects of the presentation. Maybe. Thursday morning came. The executive meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the glass-walled conference room we called the Fishbowl. When I arrived at work at 8:15, I had a new email from Scott. "Alex, I'll need you to cover the department meeting with engineering at 10 today. Something's come up with the executive presentation and I need to handle it alone. I'll catch you up later." I stared at my screen, reading the message 3 times, the knot in my stomach tightening. I'd been cut out. But I still clung to a shred of optimism. Maybe there was a legitimate reason. Maybe the executives had requested a shorter meeting with fewer people. Maybe Scott would present my work and give me credit. I replied simply, "No problem. Good luck with the presentation." Then I opened my calendar and accepted the engineering meeting, even as I felt something hardening inside me. Something my parents' immigrant philosophy hadn't prepared me for. What to do when playing by the rules means watching someone else take what's yours. At 9:45, I headed to my meeting with engineering, but not before walking past the fishbowl. Scott was already there, setting up his laptop, arranging printed presentations at each seat. Through the glass, I could see him talking animatedly to our CEO, Julia Winters. He looked confident, excited. Ready for his moment. The engineering meeting was a blur. I answered questions mechanically, made notes I'd never review, all while part of my mind remained in that other meeting, imagining Scott presenting my work as his own. When I returned to my desk at 11:30, the company-wide email had already gone out. Congratulations to Scott Mercer for his innovative supply chain automation initiative presented to leadership this morning. The projected $2 million in annual savings represents one of the most significant operational improvements in Vertex's history. Scott will be leading implementation effective immediately. There it was in black and white. No mention of me. No acknowledgement of my work. Nothing. I sat there, staring at my screen, as colleagues stopped by Scott's office to congratulate him. I watched through the glass partition as he accepted their praise with that practiced, humble smile. I saw Julia Winters stop by and pat him on the shoulder. Someone walked past my desk and said, "Tough break, man." Everyone knows Scott's been gunning for that VP position opening up next quarter. And that's when it clicked. The VP of Operations role. The internal posting had gone up last month. Scott was 42, had been at the same management level for 5 years. This was his chance to finally move up, and my project was his ticket. I should have been furious. I should have marched into Julia's office and exposed him. But instead, I felt a strange calm descend over me. Because in that moment, I remembered something important. Every file in our system was automatically timestamped and logged. Every edit, every creation, every access, all recorded in the system. Scott had stolen my work. But he'd left digital fingerprints everywhere. I didn't confront him that day. Or the next. I watched as he basked in his success, as he began leading implementation of my project, as he scheduled meetings to discuss his innovation. I attended those meetings, nodded along, offered technical insights when asked, all while I was making my own quiet moves, because my dad taught me something else besides working hard. Even the smartest person makes mistakes. Scott was smart, but he'd made a critical error. He thought I was just another quiet Asian American tech worker who would accept being steamrolled rather than make waves. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The first thing I did was pull all the system logs showing file creation timestamps for the entire project. Every spreadsheet, every script, every presentation slide, all with my user ID, all created weeks or months before Scott even knew about the project. I downloaded these logs and saved them to my personal cloud storage. Evidence item number 1. Next, I went through my email history. Every status update I'd sent to Scott over the past 3 months about the project's progress. His minimal responses, mostly variations of "looks good, keep going." The final email where I sent him all the files with his telling reply about incorporating my work. I forwarded these to my personal email. Evidence item number 2. I also had my original project proposal from 3 months ago submitted through our internal innovation portal where employees could pitch ideas for process improvements. The submission clearly outlined what I planned to do and was timestamped January 15th. Scott had approved it with a single comment. Approved. Low priority, work on this when other tasks permit. Evidence item number 3. But I knew I needed more than just digital proof. I needed allies, witnesses who could corroborate that this was my work. Reena Patel from the IT department had helped me troubleshoot some of the automation scripts. I hadn't told her the full scope of the project, but she knew I was working on supply chain automation. I casually stopped by her desk one afternoon. "Hey Reena, remember those scripts you helped me with back in February? The ones for the supply chain automation." "Sure," she said, looking up from her monitor. "That was some complex stuff you were working on. Did you ever get it finished?" "Yeah, actually it's being implemented now. Scott presented it to the executives last week." She frowned slightly. "Scott? But it was your project, wasn't it? You wrote all those scripts." I just nodded, letting her draw her own conclusions. I didn't need to say anything else. From the way her expression changed, I could tell she understood exactly what had happened. "That's not right, Alex," she said quietly. "It is what it is," I replied with a shrug. "By the way, do you still have any of those troubleshooting emails we exchanged? I'm trying to compile documentation for the implementation team." "I'll forward everything I have," she said. her eyes showing a mix of sympathy and indignation. Evidence item number 4, I did the same with Wei from data engineering, who had reviewed some of my early prototypes, and Carmen from finance, who had helped me validate the cost-saving projections. Each conversation was casual, non-accusatory, just enough to establish that others knew this was my work, without seeming like I was building a case. But that's exactly what I was doing. 1 week after the executive presentation, Scott called me into his office. He was leaning back in his chair, looking satisfied with himself. "Alex, I want you to lead the technical implementation of the automation project. You're familiar with all the details, and this will be good visibility for you." The irony was almost laughable. He was offering me the chance to implement my own project as if it were a favor. "Sure," I said evenly. "Happy to help." "Great attitude," he replied, seemingly relieved by my easy acquiescence. "And listen, I know you did a lot of the groundwork on this. When the project succeeds, there'll be plenty of credit to go around." I nodded, face neutral. "I'm sure there will be." As I turned to leave, he added, "Oh, and Julia was really impressed with the presentation. This put me in a strong position for the VP role." There it was, confirmation of his motive, straight from his own mouth. "Congratulations," I said. "That's quite an accomplishment." The next few weeks were a strange dance. I led the technical implementation of my own project, attending meetings where Scott would introduce his innovation before turning things over to me for the technical details. I watched him take additional victory laps as the initial implementation showed promising results, exactly as my projections had predicted. Meanwhile, I continued gathering evidence. I discovered that Scott had created his presentation slides just 1 day before the executive meeting, copying and pasting from my documents, sometimes so hastily that he forgot to change the document properties that still listed me as the author. I learned that he'd given Julia Winters a preview of the project during his strategic meetings downtown, the day before the presentation, presenting my work as if he'd been developing it for months. That I found out that he'd started dropping hints about his big project to executives weeks before I'd even told him about it, creating the impression that he'd been working on it all along. Every discovery reinforced what I already knew. This was a calculated theft, not a misunderstanding. Throughout all of this, I maintained my professional demeanor. I did my job. I implemented my project. I even helped Scott prepare for follow-up meetings with the executive team. To anyone watching, I was the model employee, seemingly untroubled by my manager taking credit for my work. But inside, I was playing a longer game. By the end of April, phase 1 of the implementation was complete, and the results were even better than projected. The automated systems were on track to save $2.4 million annually, exceeding my original estimate. Scott was riding high on this success, practically measuring the dimensions of the VP office. That's when Julia Winters announced that formal interviews for the VP position would begin in May. Scott was considered the frontrunner, largely due to his innovative supply chain solution. It was time for me to make my move. I didn't want a public showdown. That wasn't my style, and frankly, it wouldn't serve my purposes. Instead, I requested a private meeting with Scott on a Friday afternoon, when most people would be winding down for the weekend. "Do you have a few minutes?" I asked, standing at his office door. "Sure. Come in," he said, barely looking up from his computer. "Make it quick, though. I've got a call with Julia in 20 minutes. I closed the door behind me and sat down across from him. "I wanted to talk about the supply chain automation project," I began. "What about it? The numbers look great. Is there a problem with the implementation?" "No, the implementation is fine. It's working exactly as I designed it to." He looked up at that, his expression hardening slightly at my emphasis on the word "I." "Alex, I know you did some of the technical work, and I've acknowledged that." "Some of the technical work," I interrupted, my voice still calm. "Scott, I conceived, designed, and created the entire project. Every spreadsheet, every script, every projection. All before you even knew about it." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "That's not how I remember it. We collaborated on this project from the beginning." "We both know that's not true," I said, opening my laptop. "I have the original project proposal from January with your approval comment stating it was low priority." I have all the system timestamps showing I created every file. I have our email exchanges where you barely engaged with the project until I mentioned the $2 million figure. His expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. A flash of concern quickly masked. Look, Alex, in corporate environments, managers often represent the work of their teams. That's just how it is. I never claimed I did this alone. Except you did, I replied, turning my laptop to show him the company-wide email. Congratulations to Scott Mercer for his innovative supply chain automation initiative. No mention of me or anyone else. That was HR's wording, not mine, he said dismissively. What about when you told Julia you'd been working on this for months during your private meeting with her? Was that HR's wording too? That caught him off guard. He hadn't known I was aware of that meeting. What exactly do you want, Alex? He asked finally. His voice hardening. IT was the question I'd been waiting for. I want 3 things, I said calmly. First, I want you to send a company-wide email clarifying that the supply chain automation was primarily my work, with your guidance. He started to protest, but I continued. Second, I want you to revise the project documentation that's being submitted for the VP position to accurately reflect my contributions. Now he was getting angry. And the third thing? I want a promotion to senior data architect with a 20% salary increase, effective immediately. He actually laughed. That's not happening. You're overplaying your hand here, Alex. It's your word against mine, and I'm a director while you're just an analyst. I nodded slowly. I thought you might say that. That's why I've prepared this. I slid a folder across his desk. Inside was a comprehensive documentation of everything I'd gathered. System logs, emails, witness statements from colleagues, original file timestamps, meeting records, all clearly demonstrating that the project was mine from inception to execution. It's not my word against yours, I said quietly. It's your word against the evidence. Evidence that I'm prepared to share with Julia Winters, the executive team, and if necessary, HR and legal. The color drained from Scott's face as he flipped through the folder. This would destroy your career, you know, he said, his voice low. No one likes a whistleblower. Maybe, I acknowledged, but it would definitely destroy yours, especially right before the VP decision. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the clock on his wall. The email goes out Monday morning, I continued. The project documentation is revised by Wednesday. The promotion paperwork is submitted by Friday. I'm not asking for public humiliation or an apology, just the correction of the record and appropriate recognition of my work. He closed the folder and pushed it back toward me, his jaw tight. And if I refuse, then on Monday morning, Julia Winters will receive this folder instead of seeing a correction email from you. The choice is yours. I stood up, collected the folder, and headed for the door. Think about it over the weekend, Scott. I'll see you Monday. As I walked back to my desk, I felt strangely calm. I had no idea if my gambit would work, if Scott would capitulate or decide to fight. But for the first time since this whole situation began, I felt in control again that I had spoken my truth, backed by evidence. Whatever happened next, I would no longer be a silent victim. I packed up my things and left the office, stepping out into another Seattle spring shower. But this time, the rain felt refreshing rather than dreary. I had taken action. Now I just had to wait. Monday morning arrived with a knot in my stomach. I'd spent the weekend alternating between confidence in my approach and anxiety about the potential fallout. Corporate America doesn't always reward those who rock the boat. Even when they're in the right. I arrived at the office early, before most of my colleagues. To my surprise, Scott was already there, door closed on a call. Through the glass, I could see his face was tense, his free hand repeatedly running through his hair. A nervous gesture I'd noticed in stressful meetings. At 9:15, the company-wide email arrived in my inbox. Subject: Clarification on Supply Chain Automation Project Team. I want to provide some important clarification regarding the Supply Chain Automation Initiative that was presented to leadership last month. While I had the privilege of presenting this innovative solution to our executive team, the project was primarily conceived, designed, and developed by Alexander Chin in our analytics department. Alex's exceptional work is projected to save Vertex approximately $2.4 million annually, exceeding initial estimates. His technical expertise and creative problem-solving were the driving forces behind this project. With guidance and support from management.as, we continue implementing this solution across the organization. Please direct technical questions to Alex, who will be leading the ongoing development as part of his expanded responsibilities. Regards, Scott Mercer, Director of Analytics. I read it twice, hardly believing what I was seeing. It was more than I'd asked for, a full acknowledgement of my work and a public recognition of my role going forward. The phrase expanded responsibilities caught my attention. Was that his way of signaling the promotion I'd demanded? An hour later, I received a meeting invitation from HR for that afternoon. The subject line simply read, "Position Discussion." When I arrived at the small conference room at 2 p.m., I was surprised to find not just Diane from HR, but also Julia Winters, our CEO. "Alex, please come in," Julia said, gesturing to a chair. "I think we have some things to discuss." My heart raced as I sat down. Had Scott gone to her with his version of events? Was this a prelude to being reprimanded or even fired? Julia didn't keep me in suspense. "I received some concerning information from Scott this morning about the supply chain automation project. He told me he had misrepresented his role and that you were actually the primary creator of the entire initiative." I nodded cautiously. "That's correct. He also shared this with me," she continued, sliding a familiar folder across the table, "my evidence dossier. He said you compiled this after he took credit for your work." I wasn't sure where this was going, so I simply said, "Yes, I felt I needed to document the truth." Julia leaned forward. "Alex, how long have you been at Vertex?" 3 years this August." She nodded. "And in those 3 years, did you ever consider that you could bring an innovative idea like this directly to me or another executive? Why work on something this significant in isolation for months?" The question caught me off guard. It hadn't occurred to me that I could bypass the chain of command. "I followed the innovation proposal process," I explained. "Submit to your direct manager, get approval, develop the concept." Julia exchanged a glance with Diane. "That process is for incremental improvements, not for multi-million-dollar innovations that could transform our operations. Scott should have elevated this immediately when you proposed it, not designated it as low priority." She paused, studying me. "It seems we have 2 problems to address. First, Scott's misappropriation of your work, which he has now admitted to. Second, a company culture where someone with your talents feels they need to work through months of development in silence rather than having a direct channel to leadership for game-changing ideas." This was not at all what I had expected. "I've spoken at length with Scott this morning," Julia continued. "He's been removed from consideration for the VP of Operations role and will be transitioning to another position within the company where he'll have the opportunity to rebuild trust." I tried to keep my expression neutral, though I was shocked by how swiftly consequences had come. "As for you," she said, "Diane has the paperwork for your promotion to Senior Data Architect, effective immediately with the salary adjustment you discussed with Scott." Diane slid another folder toward me, a formal offer letter outlining my new position and compensation. "Additionally," Julia continued, "I'd like you to join the Strategic Innovation Committee that reports directly to me. We meet bi-weekly to discuss high-impact initiatives across the organization. Your project has demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking we need." I was speechless for a moment, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. "Thank you," I finally managed. "I appreciate the recognition and the opportunity." Julia's expression softened slightly. "Alex, what happened with your project was unacceptable. But I'm impressed by how you handled it. You gathered evidence methodically, confronted the situation directly, and stood up for yourself professionally. Those are qualities we value in leadership." As the meeting concluded and I walked back to my desk with my promotion letter in hand, I passed Scott's office. He was packing items into a box, his face grim. Our eyes met briefly, and he gave me a tight nod before looking away. I felt no triumph in his downfall, only a complicated mix of vindication and regret that it had come to this. I wondered if, in his position, faced with the temptation of advancement and recognition, I might have made the same choice. I hoped not, but the corporate ladder can distort one's perspective in ways that are hard to predict until you're tested. Over the next few weeks, the story spread through the company in whispered conversations and knowing looks. I became something of a cautionary tale, both for managers who might be tempted to steal credit and for employees who now knew they should document their work meticulously. Scott was transferred to our Cleveland office as a senior project manager. A lateral move that many correctly interpreted as a demotion. Before he left, he stopped by my desk. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. "What I did was wrong." Yes, it was, I agreed, not making it easier for him. "For what it's worth, the project really is brilliant. You deserved the credit from the beginning. Thank you for acknowledging that." He hesitated, then added, "Some advice? Watch your back in that strategic innovation committee. Those executive-level politics are nothing like what you've experienced before." It wasn't much of an olive branch, but I recognized it for what it was, a grudging respect and perhaps a genuine warning. "I'll keep that in mind," I replied. As he walked away, I reflected on how quickly everything had changed. In just over a month, I'd gone from having my work stolen to sitting on a committee that reported directly to the CEO. My salary had increased significantly, my career trajectory had accelerated, and I'd gained a reputation as someone who couldn't be pushed around, all because I had the foresight to document my work and the courage to stand up for myself. The supply chain automation project continued to exceed expectations as it rolled out across the company. By the 6-month mark, it had saved Vertex $1.4 million, putting us on track to well exceed the projected annual savings. I led the implementation team, now with proper recognition, and used the visibility to advocate for other innovations from junior team members who might otherwise have been overlooked. During this period, I often thought about what my parents would say about how events had unfolded. Would they consider my confrontation of Scott to be making waves in a way they had cautioned against? Or would they see it as a necessary defense of my work and reputation? I got my answer when I visited them for dinner and shared the full story. My father listened intently, then said something that surprised me. "You know, when we told you to keep your head down and work hard, that was the advice we needed as immigrants starting with nothing. But you were born here. You have different opportunities, different challenges." My mother nodded in agreement. Standing up for yourself when someone takes what's yours isn't making trouble. It's having integrity. Their words stayed with me as I settled into my new role and responsibilities. I had always interpreted their advice as a caution against rocking the boat, but perhaps what they really meant was, choose your battles wisely, but when the battle matters, fight it with everything you have. 1 year after the presentation that Scott had hijacked, I found myself standing in the same glass-walled conference room, the fishbowl, delivering my own presentation to the executive team. This time, I was proposing a company-wide innovation initiative that would build on the success of the supply chain automation, extending similar principles across other departments. As I concluded my presentation, Julia Winter smiled. "This is exactly why we needed your voice at the leadership level, Alex. What you're proposing could transform how we operate as an organization." The VP of Operations, not Scott, but Ramyakrishnan, who had ultimately been selected for the role, nodded in agreement. "I'd like my team to be the first to implement these new protocols after supply chain success." As the meeting dispersed, Julia asked me to stay behind. "You've come a long way in a year," she observed once we were alone. "It's been an educational journey," I replied. "I'm curious, what would you say is the most important lesson you've learned?" I considered the question carefully. "I've learned that doing great work is necessary but not sufficient. How you navigate the human systems around that work is equally important." She nodded approvingly. "Many brilliant people never realize that. They believe merit alone should be enough. In an ideal world, it would be," I said. "Perhaps. But we work in this world," she countered with a slight smile. "Which brings me to why I asked you to stay. The board has approved a new position, Chief Innovation Officer, to report directly to me. I'd like you to consider it." I was stunned. "That's a significant jump from my current role." "It is," she acknowledged. "But your combination of technical expertise and what I'll call political awareness is rare. You create exceptional work and you know how to protect and advocate for it. We need that at the executive level." As I walked out of the fishbowl, contemplating Julia's offer, I passed my old cubicle, now occupied by a new analyst who had no idea of the drama that had unfolded a year ago. I thought about the version of myself who had sat there naively sending all his hard work to a manager who would try to claim it as his own. What would I tell that version of myself if I could go back in time? I'd tell him that his immigrant parents' advice about working hard was only half the equation. That in the corporate world, perhaps in life generally, you need to be your own strongest advocate. That documentation isn't just good practice, it's protection. That speaking truth to power is terrifying but sometimes necessary, and most importantly, I'd tell him that standing up for himself wouldn't end his career, it would catapult it forward in ways he couldn't imagine. Later that week, I accepted the Chief Innovation Officer position. My first official act was to implement a new company policy. All significant innovations would be documented with clear attribution to their creators, regardless of position in the hierarchy. Managers could present their team's work to leadership, but original creators would be present in the room and acknowledged explicitly. I called it the transparency in innovation policy, but privately. I thought of it as the anti-Scott rule. 6 months into my new role, I received an unexpected email from Scott Mercer. He was still at the Cleveland office, though I'd heard he was doing well there, rebuilding his reputation through more ethical means. Alex, I've been following Vertex's new initiatives under your leadership. The transparency in innovation policy is particularly interesting. I can guess where the inspiration came from. I want you to know that what happened between us fundamentally changed how I approach management. I learned a painful but necessary lesson about integrity and giving credit where it's due. In a strange way, I'm grateful for how things played out. Congratulations on your continued success. Scott, I stared at the email for a long time before responding. Scott, thank you for your note. While I wouldn't have chosen the path we took to get here, I'm glad something positive came from it for both of us. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most valuable. I wish you continued success in Cleveland. Alex, as I hit send, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. A year and a half ago, I was a data analyst whose biggest project had been stolen. Now I was a C-level executive implementing company-wide policies to prevent what had happened to me from happening to others. The $2 million my project had saved Vertex had opened doors, but it was how I'd handled the theft of my work that had truly changed my trajectory. By methodically documenting everything, by confronting the situation directly but professionally, by standing up for myself without burning down the building, I demonstrated qualities the company valued more than just technical skill. I'd shown that I understood how organizations really work, the complex interplay of merit, politics, documentation, and advocacy that determines whose ideas rise and whose remain unrecognized. That evening, as I packed up to leave the office, I glanced at the small, framed document on my wall, a printout of the original system timestamp from the very first file I'd created for the supply chain automation project. January 15th, 10:42 a.m. A digital moment that had changed everything. I kept it there as a reminder. In a world where ideas are currency and credit is power, the truth leaves footprints if you know where to look. And sometimes those footprints can lead you all the way to the top.